and how we are very excited to have you here. I thank you very much. Most of the people here are my students, my master or doctoral or PhD student. Apart from Cecilia Magalhães, who is also here, who was my advisor and has been my colleague for more than 20 years. We are the leaders of our research group, and we are very excited to have you with us in this moment to discuss your research, to talk about it. So thank you very much for being here and for the opportunity that my students will have to have you here on Zoom. But as I told you before, hopefully soon we will also have you here in Brazil with us, for you to visit our projects and work with us to think about ways of reflecting about our reality, and for you to also understand a little bit about the projects that we do. But normally, I spend more time with them presenting themselves, but because today is we have a very tight schedule, I will leave it for you to say what you want to say, and then for them to ask you questions about your research, if you are okay with that, and then they can introduce themselves as we go along this process. Is that okay for you?
Absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, whatever format you want to make this, it's okay with me. As I said, like I'm happy to help in whatever way I can. I think that these international collaborations are going to be key for understanding. And for me, science and academia are, if they're not based on intellectual generosity, then they're not based on anything.
That's
so
right.
Yeah. So thank you for having me here. I'll just give a very brief introduction, but when I say very brief, please take that with a pinch of salt, because for an academic, brief is usually a very flexibly used word. Yeah. And so I'm an economic anthropologist by training. My PhD is in archaeology, and I combine ethnography, econometric analysis, chemical analysis of glasses and different kinds of materials to understand, and as well as historical archival analysis of ancient commerce, to try and understand why it was between 1500 and 1800 AD, we suddenly start to see a lot of the ports that had existed along the coasts, especially in Africa, in the Indian Ocean, in the Mediterranean, along the Atlantic seaboard, in the South China Sea, that basically 90 to 95% of these ports collapsed globally. And the ones that remained were the biggest ever. And so basically so that was my dissertation research, where I looked at, compared India and East Africa, the ports over there and then did the study over there to come up with a model. Incidentally, this week we are turning in a grant proposal that I'm working with people at the Environmental Change Initiative at Notre Dame. It's a bunch of engineers, hydrological engineers, paleoclimatologists, and archaeologists, who basically, we took that anthropological model that I developed in my dissertation and we made it into a mathematical model to try and understand why is it that when you have boom times, like, when economies are suddenly growing, that you actually start to see the rise of inequities. And, when you have most of the previous places collapsing and then a few places becoming bigger, but the power and wealth is increasingly concentrated in the hands of the few. So we've combined both mathematical and anthropological approaches to come up with a general model to basically showcase why this is happening and under what conditions do regional systems actually collapse. So basically, you either adapt by becoming unequal, or the whole system actually collapses, and then you have even more inequality when you have this collapse at regional level. The other part of my research is actually working with conflict economies and refugee economies. So the bulk of my work is done in East Africa over here. So northern Kenya, South Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia. We call the fun spots, the picnic zones of the world. And after years of actually spending time in war zones, I've developed a very, very macabre sense of humor, which basically keeps you sane when you see terrible things. And so I started off this work when I landed up at this refugee camp. I was hitchhiking rides on trailers trucks to go up into war zones, and I was going to go to Juba. This was back in 2008. And I landed up at Kakuma refugee camp, which was like this refugee camp that looked like a refugee camp that many of us have seen, like with people lining up for food and so on and so forth. But it also had a large departmental store in it. It had multiple banks and so on and so forth. So there's a economy over here that needed to be looked at. So that was actually my first study, when I mapped out the commercial economy of this particular place and then figured out how it was on top of a relief economy, and then how the local pastoral economies, which are very different. Should I pause to allow the interpretation?
There is another room around where people have to get in case they want to listen to it in Portuguese. There is an icon on the
Oh, I
bottom
see. Okay.
So while you are speaking, they are translating for the person.
Oh, okay.
So just because some people enter late, can I just repeat this to everyone?
Sure, please.
Just a sec. Quem precisa de interpretação, entra no ícone interpretação aqui na parte de baixo e vai para lá para ouvir em português, gente, tá bom? Não perca de ouvir direitinho lá. Okay, sorry, Raul. So in case they need to just go to another room, you just go with the flow.
Okay.
I suppose it's okay for them. If not, they would come here, and they did.
Okay. Cool. Sounds good. Okay. So the first project that I did was basically to figure out how these social economies are layered upon each other, and how different actors and factors, and like what we did was we actually mapped out the networks of the flow of goods and the networks of social relationships of the traders and so on and so forth. And then as happens with many people whose work, when somebody in the policy world calls you up and say, hey, I read your
É o que eu chamo de o diabo te tentando, né? Não como política é o diabo, né? Mas aí tem essa tentativa.
I went off and I then spent 7 years working with the World Bank, with UNHCR, with the World Food Program, with the US State Department and USAID and so on and so forth, to understand sort of like, so it's not just the relief economy that takes place at the camp, but the broader geopolitical nature of how relief is administered, and what are some of the actual realities that have nothing to do with morality, but that have to do with law. For example, who's a refugee? That's a legal question, right? It's basically based on a particular definition that has been agreed upon. But when you look at migration patterns in the Americas, I mean, majority of the people would not qualify as refugees under those particular conditions. And yet people are seeking refuge, right? Being a refugee is a legal category. Seeking refuge is basically what people do when there's any kind of force that's displacing them, or so on and so forth. So then over the years, it's kind of like that refugee project has grew to kind of like, I started doing some work in Bangladesh, and then I was doing some work in Uganda, and then in the Philippines, and in Serbia. And then last year I had sort of like, I went back to Kenya, and I actually started to focus on the local region in Kenya, to essentially say, okay, so here you have these two massive refugee camps that are about, in total, 500,000 people. And they're in desert environments, and they're surrounded by host communities that are equally as impoverished and marginalized by the Kenyan government. And in fact, for the local host governments, they actually say that for the local, the host community that are impoverished and marginalized, they actually prefer the UN to their own government. because they say that their own government doesn't even care, excepting when it comes to voting. But you know, with the UN, at least there's a modicum of concern, which does not even exist in the local government. So basically, what I have so while the archaeological research is expanded to modeling and everything, so now what we're doing with the research on the refugees is that we're trying to essentially understand how there's a new paradigm in refugee development, which is called the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework. And it's part of the Global Compact on Refugees and Migration, where there's 4 objectives. The first objective is to reduce the pressure on refugee hosting countries. The second objective is to create safe, sustainable, self-reliant, integrated communities for refugees and their hosts. The third is safe and voluntary repatriation back to the countries of origin. And the last is safe third country resettlement. Now, one of the things we know realistically is that number 3 and 4 are not possible. Nobody wants refugees, not even their home countries. And their home countries usually are in no state to be in, because the war that they fled 20 years ago has been supplanted by another war that is still as dangerous to them as the one 20 years ago, maybe even more. And so, like, for example, in Somalia, when people go back, they go back and they join the 3 million IDPs, the internal displaced peoples living in Somalia right now. And so the choices are to die in an IDP camp in Somalia or to die in a refugee camp in Kenya. And they actually prefer to come back to Kenya, because at least with the UN presence over there, there's some hope that something good will happen to them. It's funny because when I started my work in the refugee camps, I started as a critique of the UN. You know, the whole Agamben idea, you know, like how it's a terrible humanitarian system and everything like that. And after, like, it will be coming on to almost like 2 decades of working on this particular field, it's like, as bad as the UN created system is, the alternative is so much more horrendous when the UN isn't there. For example, along the Darien Gap, where you actually have individual countries that have created those asylum or those, like, you know, those migrant detention centers and so on and so forth, where nobody wants to live more than a day, because if they live there, the chances of being assaulted and so on and so forth are extremely high. And in a strange way, it's kind of given me this insight into the need for humanitarian spaces, regardless of how terrible they are to live in. You know, I essentially call it like, it's as good as it's ever going to get with these large refugee camps, because the alternative is that if you take away these refugee camps, where are you going to put the people? Nobody wants them. Not the liberals, not the progressives, not the Marxists, not the capitalists. Nobody wants refugees, because ultimately people can talk a big talk. They love to say this, we should do this and we should do that. And as long as you put that into that thing that we should do this, we should do that, you're safe, because that's not being done. That's not going to be done. And even if the most progressive people take control, they will also do the same things that people have been doing for migrants for thousands of years, which is controlling movements of migrants across cultural, ethnic, and geographical borders. So these are 2 different aspects of the work that I do. And so one is very much refugees, migration, but how climate and warfare and conflict and genocide, and but sort of trying to look at it in terms of embodied health. So we also collect biological data on nutrition. So we collect sum of skin folds to measure body fat percentage. We collect blood spots to measure Epstein-Barr virus antibodies for measure stress and C-reactive protein. We also collect fingernails for cortisol. And basically, what we are really, really trying to do is locate and map trauma in these particular spaces, the traumas of being displaced. I mean, all of you remember what it was like in the early days of the pandemic, right? When we all stayed home. And I remember talking to my refugee friends at that particular point, and what they told me was, welcome to the refugee world. You are now all displaced from your normalcy. And that is one of the most traumatic experiences you can imagine. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, okay, first of all, displacement trauma, violence trauma, trauma of the journey, trauma of the uncertainty, trauma of living in a refugee camp. And then the host community also suffers a lot of trauma, the traumas of constant shocks of poverty and everything like that. So combining network analysis, climate studies, hydrological engineering, working with faith-based communities to essentially understand the intersections between faith, between belief, between social capital, between physical health, and basically the different kind of industries that are trying to build opportunities and so on and so forth, and why they fail. So basically trying to model this at this local regional level. And then the archaeological work is trying to model like a long-term climate and urbanism and changes in urbanism like over like hundreds of years. And both of them are to build predictive models for understanding change over the long term and change in extreme conditions. And one of the reasons we're focusing on these refugee camps is that one thing we can very confidently expect in the 21st century is that things are just going to get worse. If they get better, it's not before they going to get worse. So I don't want to be a complete pessimist, but that's where we are. And migration, refuge creation, people fleeing from climate-induced or migration, violence-induced migration or anything like that. And many times these all start to run together, right? When you essentially have a lot of flooding in areas and people are moving, it creates conflict, it creates problem of food insecurity, and then there's migration. And then migration in turn creates more violences and more resource construction and so on and so forth. So if this is going to be the norm, and if refugees are not going anywhere, and we're going to have to figure out ways to maintain in humanitarian spaces millions of people living in these extreme places, in what I call the between places, right? How can we actually make them so that they're better than just the barely palatable that they are right now? We are not expecting to turn them into palaces. We are not expecting them to become first world development, but these are places that enable people to survive. And as long as people survive, they keep hope. And hope, if not for themselves, it's for their children or their grandchildren. That's how human beings work. So how we can take the people who live at bare survival and make their lives a little better, right? So basically, instead of saying we want to transform the world and make it into like this happy place and everything like that, how can we make it just that little bit better? Because that's the reality. Because at the top and in their hearts, I've spoken to many people, many well-meaning people, and so on and so forth. But the thought of refugees coming and living in your backyards is something that very, very few people would just say, yeah, sure, you can come and live in my backyard. Like, one can be generous until it is your backyard. So kind of like trying to come up with much more pragmatic solutions or pragmatic interventions to these intractable, wicked problems, rather than constantly make recommendations or like put forth solutions that have absolutely no chance of ever moving past an academic wish list stage. Okay, I'll stop there, and then I'll ask for and if you have any questions about the papers or the convenience paper or anything like that, I'd love to answer it.
I will ask Vanessa and Marisol, who work with migrants and whose research is very connected to many things that you mentioned, because they both did their research and are doing their research with migrant people in Brazil, and with their traumas and the difficulties in connecting and the suffering that it causes. And as you also said, they are dealing with the small the small things that you can do to make life more bearable. And I think perhaps they could tell a little bit about what they do and how this interweaves with what you're saying. And perhaps I think this will open the discussion, because I also want you to go back to the first topic, because I still remember the chemistry, physics things that you taught me. And I think it's very interesting for you to talk a little bit about, because we talk about the social conditions of people. And I think that after they talk about this part, I would like you to talk about the other one that you just mentioned a little. So who goes first, Marisol or Vanessa? Do you want to speak English or Portuguese, Vanessa?
Eu acho que eu posso português.
Raul, do you mind changing to the interpretation?
No, I mean, okay.
Acho que a Marisol saiu.
Go to the... No, Marisol, the icon below here is interpretation. Can you see it?
Okay, where is it? It's
On the bottom, you see interpretation.
the interpretation English. Is that the one?
I think if you go, I don't know if they will speak in Portuguese or in the English one, but anyway, they will speak English to you.
Oh, okay. The interpretation icon. Okay, so what should I change it to?
You just change to Portuguese, because then I know they are there and you will listen to them. Tudo bem, Paulo? Ok, Raul? Então, Vanessa, vai lá. E a gente checa com o Raul. Tá falando lá? Então vai.
Posso, Fê?
Pode. Vai lá, pode falar, Van. Pode falar, Van.
Deixa eu ver.
Você não muda nada, você fica aí mesmo.
Eu fiz a troca, Fê, não sei como avisar para ele.
Você não faz troca nenhuma, você fica na sala mesmo, você só fala.
Então tá bom. Boa noite, professor. Eu sou a Vanessa Caires, professora de língua portuguesa, e a minha área de atuação é a educação. Eu sou professora.
And this is the standpoint of my experience.
Ensino fundamental. Então, por meio da literatura, eu sensibilizo os estudantes para a causa do imigrante, do refugiado, e o meu projeto de pesquisa de doutorado visa trazer essas temáticas, sensibilizar os estudantes para a temática do refúgio, da migração forçada, para que esses estudantes entendam um pouco mais desses fenômenos que afetam diretamente essa ferida que causa nos direitos humanos em todo o mundo, e que também, e que se ainda em menor escala, mas também afetam os estudantes, as pessoas que chegam aqui no Brasil. Eu gostaria de saber se a sua pesquisa traz algum olhar relacionado ao campo da educação, os estudantes que vão para a escola, as crianças que ficam sem estudar, ou ainda se tem alguma pesquisa que vise a sensibilização dos estudantes não refugiados, os estudantes que estão consolidados em seus países, mas para a sensibilização da causa, formando novas gerações para repensar essa dinâmica, para que não haja tanta exclusão frente aos conflitos que existem no país, já que eles são crescentes e não temos uma perspectiva boa daí para frente. Como sensibilizar e trazer esse olhar a partir da escola, por favor.
Raul, if you can now come back to the main room.
Okay. I can stay there. No, thank you for that. So if I got you correctly, so you're looking at refugee education and education of migrants, and sort of like how do you So I want to ask you, it's like when you're saying education, are you talking about formal classroom instruction, or are you or are you talking about vocational instruction or formal classroom? Okay. So I've just essentially put on this one paper in the chat screen, Bellino et al. So I've been working with she would be an anthropologist of education. And so she's in the education department at the University of Michigan. And so she and I have basically like collaborated on a paper where we were talking about the sort of like, the politics of educating refugees and the problems. I also have had students who've actually gone and looked at education of refugees in Uganda, in Kyangwale refugee camp. The reality is that education of migrants and education of refugees, I mean, it depends on how the society that is responsible for that particular civic job, right, of providing the schools and so on and so forth, what the migrants' future is meant to be. So, for example, if you're a refugee, right, and even if you're studying in the national curriculum, the basic idea is that you're not really meant to be there. And you're meant to go back home or go elsewhere. You're not meant to actually stay in that particular spot. And so basically what happens is that you actually get an education where there's a constant refrain to the migrants that, so this is the part that will help you as you go back home. This is the part that is very much for whatever country you're in, like Kenya or Brazil or so on and so forth. But when you go back home, you'll carry some knowledge. But it's not about creating citizens, right? And so and the other thing about migrants. So I just got back from Ukraine, and basically like talk about an entire country that is traumatized, where every day, every hour, you get some kind of indication that some bombs are coming out of Russia, and they're going to come and they're going to attack the school. I mean, I was in bomb shelters underneath schools where there's children who've hidden, children who've been wounded, and so on and so forth under the and with the toys and everything still on those in those bomb shelters. And even there, the refugees and the migrants who have been displaced from the active war zones along the eastern and southern fronts, people still have issues with them. And I think one of the biggest problems with migrants and education, and I don't know if I'm answering your question correctly, is the tensions between the locals and the outsiders. And those are prejudices that are not because of those particular people. I mean, these are very, very common human prejudices. And so it's difficult to essentially approach them through policy. Now, one thing I can tell you is that, so in 2015, I did this project for the World Bank, where we basically collected 600, like a survey of 600 people in 4 different cities, one right next to the camp, and the other ones scattered about between like 50 to 100 kilometers away from the camp. And then we asked for negative and positive perceptions of refugees. And one of the things that we found was that distance did not seem to affect negative perceptions. Everybody had negative perceptions of refugees, whether you stayed next to the camp or you stayed far away from the camps. But the positive perceptions of refugees, basically, the closer you were to the camp, the more positive perceptions you had about the refugees. The further away you went from the camps, the more the positive perceptions just went down. So what that basically told us was that A, you're never ever going to have a purely you're never going to get rid of the tension between migrants and refugees as long as they remain, and this I'm going to use a word that I know that you linguistic types use, marked versus unmarked categories, right? As long as you have migrants who are in marked categories as migrants, they live in marked spaces, they attend or they lived marked existences where they essentially attend school, but as migrants who are receiving largesse from the university, from the society, or from the city, or whatever, there'll always be tensions. When does that tension go away? When those who are formerly marked now go into the unmarked categories. So kind of like, if I use a parallel example in the US, around 1880, 1860, 1900, 1920, all the way until 1970, to be a Greek American was to be, even though you're technically white, you're not as white as the British Americans, right? You might be Italian American, but you're not as white as the WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It took more than 100 years for those differences to disappear. Not in every way possible, but it took a long time for whiteness to be the unmarked category in which everybody who was nominally white, regardless of whether they were from what part of Europe or the white world they were, right? So it's the same thing with migrants. What I've noticed is that if you can't tell who a migrant is, the interactions tend to be better. And the one way you can actually create this consciousness is just by increasing interactions. You cannot persuade people that outsiders are good, because there's just something in people that actually loves that as an abstract concept. If they're liberal, like most of us in this room might tend to be, there's this, we love it on an abstract level, but on a more tangible, physical level, there's something that will always create the tension, that will always bring the NIMBY idea, which is not in my backyard idea. But the only thing that actually helps is just by increasing the number of interactions between the outsiders and the locals, and by removing those marked categories and then essentially making them into unmarked categories. Very often that happens through friendships, through imaginations of different relationships. When those friendships and relationships between the categories become normative, then somebody is no longer marked, they become unmarked. And being unmarked is actually the point that you want to reach. That's the only thing I can actually tell you from my research, because I usually tend to be quite a pessimist about humanity, which...
Happy to hear how positive you are in this answer.
I know, right? I mean, it's like, well, I wanted to say something good because, we're all trying to do something good, right?
We are. But it's hard to do.
It is. And the thing is that the world is full of fractures and wounds that are constantly seeping. And whether we are working in the relief or you're working with refugees from an academic perspective and everything like that, none of us are doing this particular shtick for money.
Yeah.
Right? We are not in this for money. And when you start to work with these hard topics, right? There's what drives you to keep on doing it, doing this has to keep on driving you, even though what you study is giving you trauma.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? We call it vicarious trauma. I mean, for the two of you who've spoken to the refugees and you've spoken to migrants and you've known their trauma, you felt traumatized too.
Yeah.
Right. And part of the symptom of trauma is that you can't give up the work no matter how much your body or your mind might actually tell you to. It's part of the symptom. You actually almost get like this, I need to do something complex.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, okay, let's be kind to, because, when I started off as an anthropologist, you're kind of like, oh, all these development people and all these people who are coming in, they're not going to be solving the situation. So let's critique them. And then the more time I spent with people, I actually realized that, yeah, we might hate the people in the World Bank because they're all for a neoliberal thing, but the people who are in the field with me, they were trying to do something positive. Did that work? No, because, well, the people on the ground might know the ground realities. They also have to answer to their own institutions, their own institutional inertia, and so on and so forth. And if Jim Kim could not change the culture of the World Bank because of the systemic inertia, what chances does a ragged-assed anthropologist have, you know, from the outside critique perspective? And so when I started to work for these organizations, I thought maybe giving them excellent research might change everything. I realized that's not going to change anything. I'm just going to stick to my research. But what I am going to do is I'm actually going to be kind to people and say, okay, after all this research, can we do even something that is, you know, slightly positive? So one thing that comes out of the research is the more the interactions between people, the more nuanced the interaction. And nuance is good. It's the simple interactions that get people into problem because they quickly descend into a black and white. But when people can essentially say, well, on the one hand, yes, the larger narrative is that refugees are violent and the other and so on and so forth. But on the other, I know these people and they're really nice, right? So it starts to create that particular difference, but we're still looking at a more organic process. You can't force it in many cases, and also a long-term process, right? You got to be patient. And sometimes it might not work out. I mean, sometimes it's like, you know, suddenly I remember back in somebody telling me, I don't remember this, but somebody telling me in 2003, something happened and the Turkana child died in the camp because of a snake bite, but they accused the refugees of poisoning them. But there was also like a famine drought going on in the area. So basically what happens is scapegoating and, you know, like all of those topics that we study as social scientists. This Sunday came, and then suddenly you were actually had like 50,000 people trying to get into the UN compound because they were being chased by the local community with guns and machetes. And then here's the other thing. I mean, you know, many of these camps and so on and so forth are located in places where they're surrounded by people who are poorer than they are. And then you actually have to admire the generosity of those people who are letting these strangers stay on their land. Even though they have nothing, they share what they have. And yes, their gripes and so on and so forth. But I guess what I've decided that, you know, it's just, you got to pick out some of the positives. Otherwise you'll end up.
One thing that you're saying, and to me is very important, is everybody is suffering.
Yes.
In a certain way. So we have to try to understand how these impact. I think because we don't have so much time, but that's why I wanted you to come, so we could have a small perception of what you do. But I want Marisol to tell you about the project that she does, because I think it speaks to what you're saying as well. Mari, can you give would you like to use Portuguese or English?
Posso falar boa noite, Raul. É prazer tê-lo conosco.
Raul, can you change to English, please? To the interpretation? Okay, go ahead, Mari.
Likewise.
Pode ir, Mari.
Oh,
Você vai
eu tô te ouvindo. Tô te ouvindo.
Você fica aí, Mari. Você fica na sala, ele vai para outra sala. Pode falar.
Tá. Fernanda, ela tá falando que não precisa mudar de canal, senão ele pode perder.
Tá bom, então vai. Então vai.
Tá. O canal é só para ouvir. Então, acho que... Tá bom? Então, boa noite, Raul. É prazer tê-lo conosco. A minha pesquisa de doutorado, que vou defender agora dia 27 de novembro, é sobre acolhimento de migrantes, né? Então, eu percebo que há uma diferença na chegada de refugiados com migrantes. Talvez os protocolos sejam mais simples, entre aspas, dos refugiados do que migrantes. Aqui, os migrantes que chegam no Brasil, eles têm essas marcas, né? É diferente um migrante da Europa, um americano, do que um da Venezuela, do Haiti ou da Bolívia. Na minha pesquisa, então, eu entrei numa escola onde algumas crianças tinham a suspeita de ser autistas, de 11 crianças, 9 bolivianas com essa hipótese de autismo, e chegamos à conclusão que a língua é uma barreira. né? É uma barreira muito importante em todos os âmbitos, na educação, no atendimento hospitalar, enfim, é uma questão que comecei a fazer um trabalho na comunidade com os professores, o ensino do espanhol por meio da atividade social. E o nosso foco de pesquisa aqui no LAR se chama PCCOL, é Pesquisa Crítica de Colaboração, na qual, observando o que acontece, a gente tem a possibilidade de intervir no meio. E isso foi E a Cissa, que é a nossa fundadora da PCCOL, junto com a Fernanda, aí a gente consegue intervir no meio. Então, o que aconteceu? Eu dei aula de espanhol por meio da atividade social para os professores, e a escola inteira começou a se mobilizar no sentido de tornar bilíngues, e que esses migrantes da Venezuela, da Bolívia, consigam ter esse sentimento de pertencimento. Então, o trabalho foi feito em não trabalhar uma língua em detrimento da outra, que elas coexistam no ambiente, seja na didática dos professores, nos protocolos, nas tarefas de casa, e, além disso, com todas as famílias, as reuniões bilíngues. Então, por exemplo, criado um grupo de WhatsApp para atender essas famílias, essa demanda. A minha pergunta é, existe algum movimento e essa preocupação com a acolhida, né? Porque se a gente pensar em migração, em refúgio, eu acho que isso existe desde a época mais remota. E como a gente pode trabalhar com isso? Eu acredito que um ponto é trabalhar a diversidade, fazer que ela seja presente e importante nos âmbitos, como um fator de enriquecimento. Queria ouvir um pouquinho.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you're very right that this has gone on for a long time. I mean, one of my favorite examples is from the 3rd to the 5th centuries AD in the Danube region in the Roman Empire. So a lot of Gothic refugees were pouring in there because of the wars and conflicts further up in Gothland, and then with the Hunnic invasions and so on and so forth. And Rome basically went through about 250 years of changes in how it should manage its refugees. You know, like sometimes they'd segregate them, mark them, and then put them in camps. Then they'd say, no, let's not segregate them. Let's give them farms and everything so they can Romanize themselves. And so they'd flip back and forth over 250 years, pretty much what we're doing right now. Until when Attila invaded, the refugees were very angry with the Romans because the Roman relief officials, that some of them had been corrupt and stolen some of the money. So the refugees got angry and refused to join the Romans. And they refused to fight on the side of the Romans, which is why the Huns were able to sweep through. So one of the things that it tells me is that many of these problems that we've been having have been going on for a long time. But I think that one of the things that we have to understand is that people who are displaced are suffering from trauma, and the normal rules do not apply, right? You can't get a traumatized person who probably suffering from some form of PTSD, or, you know, if they're living in marked spaces and now they're suffering maybe even from complex PTSD. I mean, you're basically talking about people whose neurological system has been compromised, whose endocrinological system has been compromised, who's got compromised immune function. The low-grade inflammation is basically depressing because one of the things, a lot of stress, a lot of unhealthy eating, a lot of trauma and everything, it creates this low-grade inflammation inside you that's always with you, which not only has bad outcomes for long-term health effects like physical health, but it also depresses the ability for people to respond to incentives. And that's why you actually see many times high levels of depression, or what you essentially in these particular populations, even though they're being fed and so on and so forth. So one of the things that you're looking at is that, so what you're doing, you know, offering support is basically key. It is absolutely the best thing that you can actually do. Now, with this, what I would actually suggest is if you can offer psychosocial support, and not only for those people with diagnosed, clinically diagnosed conditions, but those without, because anybody who's displaced is undergoing some form of trauma. And when I say displaced, I mean involuntarily, forcibly displaced, right? And so, and so the idea is that, like, you know, for most of the time, we approach people who are displaced or so on and so forth with this particular notion that, well, they're displaced, but if we give them enough infrastructure and support and so on and so forth, they will be fine. But displacement is not that easy, right? I mean, it's created these traumas, it's created this very, very interesting world in which there's a constant recursive impacts and feedbacks from all the negative stresses and shocks of the day-to-day, and then their overall journey of displacement and so on and so forth. So very often, the best practices here would be to also say, okay, not only offering in terms of like linguistic support or infrastructural support, but you also have to offer psychosocial support. Number one, enable people to like give people permission to feel the pain without having to bury it deep inside. With men, you have a much bigger problem because men don't talk about any of this. When I was in the Ukraine, all these people who'd come from the war, the men were like, you know, these people had been brutalized in ways you can't imagine. I mean, this is like mass atrocities, genocide level stuff that that was perpetrated on them in the occupied territories. And I mean, you know, like the men would be like, no, I'm okay. And you're looking at the guy and you're like, no, you're about like this close to wanting to shoot yourself in the head, wanting to drink yourself to death, or, you know, like, or commit violence or something like that. So if we are to minister to the refugees, we have to understand that the whole concept of Maslow's hierarchy of needs was wrong. He was absolutely wrong. Maybe he was right for his time. I don't like to go back and rip down people who did good stuff before, because, I mean, logically it makes sense. You know, if you don't have food or water, you'll die. So if that's provided to you first, and then other things provided later. But now what we're realizing is that given the massive natures of the traumas and so on and so forth, it's not a hierarchy of needs, it's a web of needs. Your spiritual, psychological, your biological, your security, your social needs, all of them actually form a web of interactions. So just feeding somebody doesn't do anything to them, which is why people sell their food into the black market to buy some of the good stuff, right? Because if you greet a child through like, you know, like to this world, you can't do that with relief food. You have to do that with culturally appropriated foods. I mean, in Somalia, that means having a biryani with meat in it and so on and so forth. So what do? When your child is born, you might not have anything, but you have that relief food, and you'll forego eating for 10 days, and you'll go and sell that portion of food in the black market so you can buy feast for one day, right? And this is what gives you normalcy. And through normalcy, you get a little bit of dignity. Now, people can do this if they have some ways to negotiate. And so, which is why I actually think that the humanitarian space gives some people the ability to build on top. And in your case, I would actually suggest that when you're looking at the support, see how you can expand the support that you're actually giving. So it's a totality. So the language barrier is absolutely important. The barrier to institutional support is absolutely important. So is the barrier to accessing mental health issues. So is the barrier to actually sociality, because many times numbness and depression essentially make you. So basically, there's this beautiful line that somebody has said over here. I don't know who it is, but the question is how to create the desire to be together, which is right now, this is the conversation that is happening whether you want to say, let's build the environment in a way that it creates communities, or let's actually create communities by creating events and processes that bring people together, right? And in so doing, you have to make it in places that are unmarked so that nobody's seen as like, because the idea of charity becomes problematic very quickly, right? People who are displaced forcibly don't like to be seen as the recipients of charity. Because, before they were displaced, they had lives. They had lives filled with normalcy and dignity. And even if they're poor, they still had lives of their own. And now they're in these places where every part of their biophysical and psychological, social, political being is measured and supervised, and it's marked. So to break out of that cycle, you actually have to bring them to a point where they're no longer seen as that. And I mean, unfortunately, it would take a lot of investment from us to actually say, it's not just about, it's about all kinds of support. So what you're doing is absolutely the correct thing. What I would suggest is add on to it, get some people to actually start to have them talk about the displacement, right? The women, I can connect you with with some people at Notre Dame, including my wife, who have actually realized that when you want to talk to women, having a coffee and a bunch of women together who don't know each other actually works very well, because people want to talk. I can usually get some men to talk, but it's usually like it has to be in a different kind of space, and it has to be more informal in a strange way. It can't be a formal gathering. So yeah, I would love to keep on talking, but I know that Fernanda has to leave.
I have a plane to catch. They are killing me on the back and on the backstage, you see, because they have plenty of questions. So Raul, you will have to come back, because I told them about the social part, which we didn't touch much today in the questions, and they have plenty of questions for you. So you already have a meeting scheduled for next semester with us. Is that right? Can I count on you?
Yes.
Great.
Absolutely.
And then we will work on how we can bring you back, bring you to Brazil so you can be here with us discussing, in person about these things. We are very excited. And people, open your cameras for us to say a very big round of applause to him. Come on. Woohoo! Raul, thank you very, very much. And we're very, very happy to have you here. Thank you so much. And we do a picture, Raul. Are you okay if we take a picture with you? So,
sure.
Everyone, picture time. Open your camera. Let's do it. Nice face. Let me see. 1, 2, 3. Yes. Thank you so much, Raul. And when I'm back from this trip, I'll be in touch with you again to tell you about what the impressions and everything, and to set our next step. Thank you so much. I loved it. And I love to know that your wife is also into this discussion. Perhaps in the next one, we can have her together.
Absolutely. And when you said, when you told me at one point, it's like, would you consider coming to Brazil? I'm like, you don't have to ask. That's one of those places that, every person born on this earth has to go there at least once.
So let's plan for who knows, perhaps next semester already. If you have a spot, we can try to find a way.
Well, from your mouth to their ears.
Great. I was at your place and now you come here. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Raul. And we will be in touch again. We want to get this movement going. And I think you have plenty of things that all my students can learn from. You just heard from 2, but there are plenty of other things that you will enjoy getting to know more about.
And I'm looking forward to learning from everyone as well. So
thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye-bye, everyone. See you. I'll send kisses from Cuba to you.
Boa viagem.
Beijos da Cuba.
Yes. Bye-bye. Tchau, gente.
Bye.